Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for this session on a billion-dollar industry, which is the EdTech industry, and how today the financial world and the investors, they're looking to make this industry bigger with the help of and working closely with the EdTech founders to help them to grow and to scale their businesses, not just in India, but also globally. So I have a stellar panel here with me today. VCs, as well as Imran from a PE fund, as well as Amit Patel from Owl Ventures, who's joined us globally from USA. And I know it's very late there, so thank you very much, Amit, for joining us. This is indeed, we've been doing the Indian Education Congress for, I think, about 10 years, and this is perhaps one of the most stellar panel and the most sort of changing moment that I have seen in this industry at this point of time, and from where we've had like several panels today since morning, and AIC chief was speaking, and the way government as well as the way the investing world, the entrepreneurs themselves are looking at the industry. I feel that the industry will be very different from what we have seen it. Deborah has also joined us. Hello, Deborah. It's wonderful to have you with us today. So let me kickstart this discussion by first having a question for Karan. Now, Karan, I understand. So, Karan, I understand that mobile education has certainly democratized, online learning, and I feel that EdTech would continue to rise. It's probably, while we feel that we've come a long way, but I think in some ways things have just beginning to start. So, particularly from the pre-pandemic times to now, and probably going forward, hopefully post-pandemic soon, how do you see the EdTech industry evolving, and how do you see things changing in the times to come? And particularly, what have you been doing, which is very interesting, that you would want to share with us today? Can I please request somebody to mute themselves at the back end, just to avoid the noise? Thanks, Karan. Over to you.
Oh, thanks so much, Ritu. Thanks for having me. Look, I think there are some obvious changes that we've seen in the last 12 to 15 months. I think two of them being the most stark ones, and we're an early stage tech fund, right? So I think for us, we do come in early. Among many things, I think two things which stand out. One is how the use of mobile education, specifically to your question, has gone down in terms of beyond obviously remote classes for younger children, which is the norm right now. But I think it's sort of become all pervasive in terms of how education is consumed and how education is engaged with between children and amongst communities of children. This is anywhere from 5 and upwards. We saw a little bit of that obviously with what White Hat Junior was being able to do, but I think it's gone to a whole new level. And so that primarily will become a little bit of a trend which will stay. It'll change. It's already changed behaviors, and I think mobile first will become more and more the norm on the top 10% of the population, right? And the demographics within that. The second, which is far more interesting in terms of just sheer volumes, is how, for example, bringing in vernacular speaking communities into the fold, into the digital fold, under the whole umbrella of mobile education, whether it be for job training, whether it be for test preparation, either for government jobs or for competitive exams, or for simple things such as upskilling. I think that is something which we at least did not see too much technology doing in a large way pre-pandemic. There was a lot of offline businesses which were doing that and catering to local users within different states. But now you're seeing the ability for a digital platform to really expand across multiple states at the same time. And I think the third is just how local influencers, local community leaders are again propagating the use of technology through which education can be imparted for different things. And I think there again, jobs and upskilling probably play the largest role. So I think those are three things that we've seen at a ground level, which at least for the most part, I think are kind of here to stay for in some shape or form. Some of these could take hybrid forms in terms of also having something in the offline world. Don't see that happening anytime soon. I think there's enough of demand on the pure digital side. And that's actually where some of our up and coming investments are getting done.
Sure, that's very interesting. We're absolutely looking forward to reading and writing about them here at Entrepreneur. Pranav, let me ask you this, given what Karan has said, and and so work from home, understandably, is not something that is going to remain forever. I also see Imran is sitting in his office today. So, particularly now with things looking to change, we've seen some tremendous rise of EdTech, which has happened during this time. But once schools open up, universities, children go back to universities, how do you think they would consume EdTech at that point of time? For nothing else, but they would be short on time to see or do as much browsing or learning from online engines as they could do during the pandemic times. So what impact are you foreseeing on the EdTech industry once we're out of the pandemic? And also, do you see any collaboration models happening, particularly between the core education and the EdTech education? I mean, that would actually benefit everybody, pretty much the student community.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Ritu. I think those are good questions. So firstly, I think when students come back to school, we expect that should happen over the next quarter or so. You're absolutely right. There will be less time available to students in general for obviously digital education and so on. What we've seen over the last year, Ritu, has been interesting. There's been an acceleration of the serviceable component of the total addressable market, meaning more students have had the opportunity and time to just experience more of what is available online and sample many different formats, many different companies, many different platforms and products and services, peer-to-peer, group tuition, one-on-one. So there's been this very rapid expansion of the experimentation students have had access to with different formats. What they've also done over the last 12 months, I would say, at least in India, is they've built their preferences on what works for them. They never had the time to really sit back and spend so much money and or time, whether it's free or paid, to build their preferences. And now, obviously, when we see the retention curves for all of these different formats, different companies, we now know what types of students, what segments of students, whether it's at the subject level for math, for science, for language, there are different behaviors, different habits being formed. So over the last 12 months, I think that's been phenomenally positive for the overall EdTech market. From what I'm told, in the US, in Western Europe as well, in China and Japan, we have friends everywhere who are now investing in EdTech. We're seeing similar stories coming out of those geographies as well. So you're absolutely right. Once school starts and once time becomes a more constrained resource, what you will see is students will now become very focused on spending time and money on their preferences. Alongside this, of course, EdTech is a unique market where the consumer is a student, but the customer, the person who pays, is the parent. Parents have also experimented with different formats, built their preferences, and are now more comfortable spending more time and getting their child to spend more of their time as well on very specific formats, and they've built their preferences as well. So we will see much more focus on these preferences. Companies that have earned the trust, built credibility, have stood by their customers, stood by experiences, responded rapidly to changing concerns, changing demands from parents, from students, from teachers, from schools, from even policy, like you mentioned. I think those companies will grow even faster now that time is a constraint. We'll also see dollars being focused now on very specific formats. So whether it's curricular high school, curricular, higher ed, pre-engineering, pre-medicine, whether it's early childhood, which is a large untapped market in our opinion. So again, a lot of habit formation that we're seeing there. You will see that the focus of spending and time is going to help some companies pull out faster than others. So yes, definitely an exciting time that we've gone through last 12 months. We foresee the next 12 months should be even more exciting in terms of where that time, energy, and resource is going to be focused. On policy, you're absolutely right. We've been very impressed with how quickly the government of India has responded to the opportunity that the last 12 months presented. Of course, all of us are familiar with the new education policy that was announced here. It's been very forward-thinking. We must say we're very happy that the administration has taken a very positive view of technology's role to play in the future of Indian education. There are 220 million Indian students. And I must say, we've been doing EdTech for over a decade now. It's very, very hard to generalize what 220 million students want from one EdTech experience. So we will see more segmentation, more specialization. We will see the rise of vertical specialists in every field, for every age segment, for every subject. You will see different formats support their own unicorns. For example, doubt solving or extracurricular or only language learning or global social learning. We will see many new formats come out. And I think that's fantastic for students in the end. They will have more access, more choice, more competition on pricing. So they can obviously benefit for the inclusion segment of Indian students. And of course, I'm personally very happy to see more focus on Indian regional languages. Beyond English, beyond Hindi, many state languages, as you know, are now supporting more and more technology insertion into their state syllabi. So we expect that will also be an interesting new adjacent market that opens up that also supports innovation. So like I said, we're very happy with what's happened over the last 12 months for EdTech. We foresee certainly much more action over the next 12 months and beyond.
Sure. Thanks, Pranav. That's helpful to know, and certainly looking forward to that wave of change coming forward. Imran, I'm going to shift to you. So how do you foresee, the industry? I mean, as a PE fund, I'm sure your lenses are very different. The industry is growing and growing very rapidly. And then on the other hand, you've been an investor in offline education as well. So particularly, and I mean, we've had a classic deal of Akash classes being taken over by Byju's. Do you see any such deals on the anvil? Do you also see that, maybe the education, offline education might want to make big investments in digital education to actually now have a more clearer journey in digital rather than just probably thinking of it as an interim junction? So how do you as an investor are seeing things, particularly from a M&A perspective in the industry?
Sure. Thanks, Ritu. As you know, Gaja Capital invests at the growth stage of private equity. So we invest typically $25 to $40 million in every deal. We're comfortable buying control. And we invest in education, employment, and employability. So we have a broader definition of this opportunity. And EdTech is a very important, let's say, sliver of growth that has accelerated, especially during the last 3 years. And I think the biggest opportunity in India right now is on the back of all the good work that our venture capital friends on this panel have done. There is a groundswell at the growth stage of that spectrum. We used to invest, and Ritu, you know this, because Gaja has been investing in education for 16 years. There used to be times in conferences like this where, you would find very few people interested in investing in education. And today people are queuing out, to invest in education. And I think it's a good sign. From roughly maybe a few $100 million per year, we are now at in excess of $2 billion a year and 100 plus deals, almost at the same level as the US. I mean, who would have thought that our investment activity will rival that of the US and in some way China? And when all of these, when this nursery of EdTech investments grow up, you will find the growth stage investments to be at obviously at much higher value, and you'll see increasing M&A, you'll see IPOs, you'll see, of course, the supersized VC investments of the type of Byju, Unacademy, and so on. So you'll see all flavors. But in sum, over the next decade, it's going to be a very exciting time for EdTech and innovation in education. You will also see at some point, like you saw in China for the last 5 years, there will be this arms race for CAC and time. These are the two most valuable resources in EdTech. And the best place to see this firsthand is try and sell to schools, because schools are always short on time, teachers are always short on time, and they always have budgetary constraints. And very soon you're going to see household, parents behaving exactly this way. They're going to be short on time. They're going to be questions around screen time and how much time a child needs to spend on EdTech. And they're going to be the obvious budgetary constraints. And therefore, the basis of competition is likely to go to the most serious end of the spectrum, which is outcomes. You're already beginning to see this in K-12 EdTech. We know from our own, from looking at the skilling end of the market, that if you don't deliver on job mobility and salary increases, you don't have a business. So in sum, I'd say it's a very exciting time for education over the next 10 years. We've said, we've been very consistent in our belief that India is the most attractive private education market in the world. It's been a story of large demand and entrepreneurship. And now with venture capital fueling innovation, I believe this will, not just serve consumers and students really well, but it will create very attractive follow-on opportunities, in investing.
Sure. No, I totally agree with you. It's going to be very interesting times, unlike what we have ever seen in the education industry. And I'm going to come back to you and ask you a little more on the early education side also. But before that, I'm going to sort of jump to Ashish. Now, Ashish, Innoven Capital, you give venture debt. So, overall, we have seen the funding pie being so very high, particularly in the education and the education tech sector during these last 2 years. So what has been your experience in the EdTech sector, particularly how has industry been consuming venture debt alongside VC funding and big funding that has been coming along? And in addition, if you can also throw some light on the K-12 segment, what are the different models that you are excited about from an EdTech sector viewpoint today?
Thanks, Ritu. So, we have been very active participant in the EdTech sector, right? And we have made over 15 investments in probably 8 or 9 in India, and have been fortunate to play a small role in journeys of companies like Byju's, Eruditus Education, Vedantu, Simply Learn, Topper, some of the newer companies, Doubtnut. So we get a chance to essentially look at the whole spectrum. And overall, it's been a very positive experience. If I were to go by segments, this would be one of the top performing sectors for us. And while there is there's a flood of liquidity that came into EdTech after COVID. So eventually there were certain companies which raised so much money that maybe we didn't have any play to do something. But on the other hand, within our portfolio as well as new companies, we were able to find some good use cases for companies that were looking to, let's say, do a big campaign and didn't want to kind of spend all the equity money. We did transactions around some acquisitions where essentially kind of an acquisition finance. There's some roll-ups that continue to happen in this space, things of that nature. Now coming back to, K-12, frankly, today is K-12 and test prep is a very crowded market. You could even argue that the winners and, I wouldn't say losers, but winners and challengers, have been decided, though every now and then you can have somebody new come in. So what we continue to look at, in addition to, kind of supporting and doing follow-on investments within our portfolio companies, is what's new, right? And I think Imran may have mentioned it, but you don't need to even look at companies to get to a public markets because there's just a lot of buyout activity. So you could even have a thesis of something, that is unique, which, somebody else could buy. So 4 or 5 things come to my mind. One is clearly executive education. I think within executive education, like Eruditus, Simply Learn, I think there's a lot of opportunity where, mid-career professionals who are willing to spend to basically upgrade their skills. They could be taking a course in blockchain or AI or data sciences or whatever. And there's a clear impact, right? And some of these courses could even be self-funded or could be funded by the organization. So affordability is not an issue. I think the second one within, when you look at the kids, and I'm talking about, let's say, grade 4 to grade 8, 9, while coding became big with White Hat, I think we are seeing a lot. This market is small, but again, at the top, the affordability levels are higher. So small market, but could be big, ARPUs around, other things. Could be robotics, could be, let's say 3D printing. So far it was largely hard skills. We are seeing some early companies that are starting to get into soft skills or what we call life skills. So you could have a platform talking about, public speaking, right? Dance or music or creative writing. So that's another interesting one we are seeing. The third one, I think Pranav mentioned on it, with respect to multilingual vernacular. Frankly, the reality is out of the 250 million odd K-12 kids, almost 85 to 90% of them come from tier 2 and smaller cities. And they are not comfortable in English. And today disproportionately, the content is in English. So their companies, and frankly, there are affordability issues. So they may not be looking for a buffet kind of pricing and they want a la carte kind of courses. So for example, Doubtnut, which is a portfolio company of ours, if somebody is looking only for doubt solving with vernacular, that could be a good use case. I think the fourth one I would say would be around closing the gap between, what you learn and get degrees versus what, employability issue. I mean, a lot of the skills are getting learned, but there is a total mismatch between what the industry wants, and there are certain platforms which are looking at that upskilling or reskilling, I would call it. I mean, the last thing that comes to my mind is, again, with respect to platforms that can offer courses that are curated by anyone. And, there are a few platforms, and these could be even cohort-based learning. There's some interesting companies coming out, largely in the Valley, where essentially anybody could put in a course, and today it's a bit of a root canal. So if somebody actually wants to run a course, you need a lot of support. But platforms could come in with curated courses and a cohort-based learning. Those would be, 5 or 6 areas we look at. And the key goal is to figure out, what's different, because the reality is, there's just a ton of capital in this space. So unless you have a very sharp differentiation, chances are you're going to struggle to compete.
Sure. That's a very interesting overview that you've given. Particularly, I quite like it that, more specialized, more a la carte, as you said, kind of education in EdTech that still has to find roots. So very interesting. Amit, I'm going to come to you now. Owl Ventures, certainly, thank you for joining us. First of all, it's a pleasure to have you here. So Owl Ventures, we understand, is one of the largest venture capital firm in the world when it comes to education technology, and you've played such a pivotal role in the EdTech sector, not just in India, but also across the world. So what kind of Indian EdTech startups do you see going global? Some of the EdTech startups have really become very, very large, like Byju's or An Academy. In fact, we just had them speaking earlier. Do you feel that their future is to actually now go out and list themselves on global bourses, or New York Stock Exchange or someplace else? Or do you feel that they should still continue to raise capital to scale faster the way they are going? What is your
opinion? Well, first of all, thank you for having me today. Excited to be a part of this discussion. I think in general, what I would say is, kind of the EdTech market is becoming more global, not just within India, but kind of around the world. At a high level, we're starting to see companies start to go international much sooner and at an earlier stage. I think, a decade ago or so, companies would have waited quite a while before they started thinking about expanding outside of their local geography. Whitehead Jr., which is a company that we've been involved in, within the first, call it 12 to 24 months of operation, started to expand internationally. And this is something that we're starting to see happen with companies that are based in India and starting to serve students from around the world. And we're also seeing kind of significant interest from companies outside of India start to think about the India market and just saying, hey, this is a market that we just can't ignore anymore, right? And it's not a market that we can say, hey, one day we will eventually get to. It's something that they're prioritizing as one of the main areas of focus. And so, when it comes to companies within India and kind of the global market, if you will, I think there's a lot of applicability and interest and frankly, competitive advantage that those companies have when it comes to global expansion. A few of those reasons, number one is, India is home to one of the largest English-speaking populations in the world. Number two is there's a, kind of just significant focus on STEM-focused careers within India, which, as we start thinking about kind of the global economy, is starting to become interwoven with as many sectors as we can possibly think of. And then number three is, kind of just acceptance of students and learners from around the world to say, hey, I don't have to live a certain proximity from my instructor or my teacher. Like, my goal is to find somebody that can really deliver a personalized learning experience to me, a one-on-one learning experience. And we've seen a number of companies in India, whether you're talking about the K-12 segment, you're talking about the higher education segment, or even the adult learning segment, where companies have really figured out a way to not only leverage technology, but leverage like human interaction to create a high quality experience for folks. And so from that perspective, I think we're just going to see rapid kind of acceleration of companies from India starting to go global, and vice versa of companies from, let's say the US market or other countries start to enter into the India market.
Sorry about that. Yeah, please go on.
No, and I guess kind of final thing that I would say is like, when it comes to companies going public in their local market or listing in other markets, I think there's a lot of real-time regulation, obviously, that's being figured out on that front. And I'd say we've seen this happen, like kind of there's a significant, not just EdTech, but in general tech, where there is significant interest in these companies kind of that are being listed, whether they're being dual listed or only listed in India. I think there's enough interest, enough appetite from public investors to say, hey, once again, these are companies that we are very interested in, see a long-term potential in. And so, I think there's going to be multiple opportunities for these early stage companies to, as Imran mentioned, potentially pursue some type of buyout strategy, to pursue kind of domestic going public, or potentially, assuming regulations kind of get figured out, some type of dual listing or international listing there.
Sure. And from a standpoint of today, with Indian EdTech startups becoming so much bigger, and there is also while we have so much going on, but honestly, if I were to say that does India have a Khan Academy, we really do not, in that sense of the word. So what is it that particularly Indian EdTech startups should take as learning from global startups, particularly from Silicon Valley startups, and try to bring it in India?
Yeah, well, I'd say it's not only one-way learning. We actually have a pretty global portfolio. Now we've invested in more than 50 companies from around the world. And, I think companies in India are learning from the companies in Silicon Valley, but several of our companies that are based in the US are learning from Indian companies as well. I'd say a few pieces of collaboration that have been particularly interesting is, let's say a company that is based in India that is trying to enter the US market, for example, or frankly, whether it's the US market or any international market, is trying to really think about, kind of the right types of partnerships that you want to have in that region. For example, in the K-12 sector, are there certain curriculum partnerships, or are there certain go-to-market partnerships that could really accelerate kind of the ability to like gain customers within that local market? And that's the same advice, frankly, that we give our US companies thinking about coming into the India market, right? Like, trying to make sure that you really understand the differences between what does the go-to-market look like in the US versus what does it look like in the India market. Simple example is, kind of in India right now, like it's very acceptable for users to provide a phone number, kind of in an onboarding process, and therefore companies can really have that kind of dialogue or interaction that happens whenever you're trying to move from a free version of a product to a paid version of a product. That's a very foreign concept for customers in the US market. If you all of a sudden started to ask for phone numbers in an onboarding process, you're going to see a pretty significant drop off in the funnel there. And so really kind of understanding the nuances of your geography, I think really matters. And so that's kind of some of the global learnings that we've been able to really benefit from, given the fact that we've invested in companies from around the world in this sector.
Surely. That's very interesting. But let me come back to you. Deborah, are you there? I am unable to see you over here on the board.
She had to leave.
Deborah had to leave. We got a message earlier. Yeah.
Okay. So, I also wanted to touch upon very quickly on, how do you see certain sectors, particularly within the entire spectrum of education, things changing? One area I'm very keen to know about is early education. Now, while there's been a great shift over, a great transformation to online learning, but it's been a challenge at the early education level. So how is it that globally markets are trying to address this market? The kids are way too small to, your study group is not just working. They're not able to absorb what you're trying to tell them through a screen. So how is that changing? And what is the likely EdTech that is going to make that happen? Would love if Amit and Imran could probably take that up.
Sure. Amit, would you like to go first?
Go ahead, Imran. I'll let you go and then.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, as you know, Ritu, we had a very successful investment in an early age through K-12 platform called EuroKids. It's now renamed as Lighthouse Learning. And during COVID, it was very challenging actually to engage with children at a very early age. I'm talking about preschoolers. And there are 2 or 3 issues there. One is this whole One is this pushback by parents on screen time. I think parents are still discovering what is good screen time versus bad screen time for children, especially at a very early age. And there's a lot of research, that research is evolving. And that gets in the way of EdTech engagement. There are other ways of engaging those children. There is, especially for children, let's say at an age of 5 or 6 and above, you could engage them through active screen time. One of our companies, Sports Village, has created online classes for sports and fitness. During COVID, you had children just sitting in front of Zoom calls all day, not being able to play. And we decided to take our live fitness classes to homes. And that was very successful. And we built the case with children and parents about active screen time as opposed to just passive screen time. But in some, I must say that, it's not for the want of innovation. I think there are a lot of interesting, ideas that have come out in early age, including what Baiju is trying to do and others. And maybe Amit, you can talk about some of the innovation you're seeing, but I'm seeing a lot of cultural pushback, both by teachers and parents for screen time at very early ages. Yeah,
that's there too. In fact, that was something that came up even in our earlier discussion when the chairman of AICTE was talking about, the psychological weight of being on screen for about 10 to 12 hours in a day. How do we address that?
Yeah, no, listen, not only from like kind of an industry perspective, but from a personal perspective, I have 2 very young kids. My daughter's 2.5 years old and my son is 5 months old. So quite young kids. And, I'd say my daughter actually, for one, just actually started going to school in person maybe a few weeks ago. And there's been a remarkable shift kind of just in her learning capabilities of having kind of that in-person interaction. And I think that really matters, kind of, especially when you're talking about kids that are, call it 2 years to kind of early elementary. And even after that, like kind of that in-person interaction really matters. And kind of being able to facilitate that is particularly helpful. And so, I think Imran touched on this, like, especially when it comes to kind of the early learning sector. A lot of what really is working and I think really resonates with the market is having solutions that, not just put a child in front of a screen or something like that to kind of hear a lecture told to him or her, but it's something that creates that like kind of interactive learning to actually happen, right? And, there's companies in our portfolio like Tinkergarten, for example, which offers kind of high quality outdoor education classes where it's not just the child that's present, but it's also the parent that's coming into the learning as well. Because a lot of times, kind of it's parents that are asking, hey, I have a very young child. I don't know exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. Am I doing the right thing? Is my child supposed to be learning this? And kind of having that technology scaffolding and solution there to create and give the parent confidence in the types of interactions they're having with the child, and kind of making sure that they're having kind of continued engaging dialogue with the child. And the other thing is, it's not about the right answer, right? It's about things like working like creativity, imagination, resilience, and things that have been shown in academic research to have a great impact on students when they do enter like kind of a more formal learning environment. And then a second example that I give from our portfolio is a company called Amira Learning, which focuses on measuring kind of oral reading fluency for students. So, kind of one of the things that have been shown in like academic research is, students, if they are not reading on grade level by the time they're, kind of in 3rd grade, they're potentially statistically unlikely to be reading on grade level by the time they graduate from high school, right? And a lot of students, depending on their personal circumstances, don't have access to an adult to actually help them kind of practice the reading, continuously. And so Amira Learning is kind of a great example of a platform that gives a student the ability to kind of practice on those skills, which is so critical during those early years. And so that's something that teachers and educators have really kind of found to be extremely helpful, especially given the kind of the other option is just to do this all analog, and it's very time intensive, and therefore students don't get as many practice sessions in kind of as they need to in order to really become masterful readers.
Sure.
Hey, Ritu, can I just say that
Sure,
Amit, you may be surprised to learn, but Amira actually has a decent user base in India through various micro communities which are actually propagating reading fluency and just checking on how the standards are progressing. But I think just to add to that, we spent a lot of time towards the end of last year just understanding early learning, both across school curriculum, extra school curriculum, outside of school curriculum, and just basic learning skills. And one of the investments we ended up doing was actually with Pranav and his team in a company called Uable. And obviously their model has evolved a little bit in the last 6-8 months, but essentially they're looking at being able to give real life skills and now more career-oriented skills to preteens and teenagers globally. So it's not an India product. They've got people from Tesla coming in and holding workshops, people from NASA coming in talk about space engineering. So it's actually phenomenal what early education, early learning, right from maybe 3 years of age, right up to 13, 14 years can actually do. But I think the segmentation around whether it's school-based or school-based curriculum outside of school, so extracurricular versus co-curricular, which and three very, very distinct ways of learning and imparting that knowledge. What we've seen work well across the board is where you've got communities which of parents if they're slightly younger students, or students if they're slightly older, and how that engagement within that let's say particular platform drives usage and goes deeper into creating very healthy cohorts. And that ultimately increases the opportunity to create monetization, because I think that's one great thing about education, which anybody from an angel investor to a PE investor likes, that you can actually monetize it fairly easily, because you're actually, you're solving value, you're solving a need which people are happy to pay value for. So I think it's been a sea change, especially from an India perspective over the last 18 months or so.
Sure. Pranav, you want to add something to this piece?
Yeah, sure thing. So I actually agree with Karan. I think we're talking about the same company. We worked with Karan on this one, and I couldn't agree more. I think like Amit said as well, the demand on early childhood in particular is to win credibility with the parents, while of course having a rooting in deep pedagogical science that keeps the interest of the child protected and focus on developing the right kind of mindset. So of course, I think education and health are coincidentally two of the largest spends in India from the family perspective, but also two of the areas where as startups we need to be very careful. We're dealing with lives, we're dealing with children. So the risk profile of these products, these apps that are being built are also much more focused upon. So I definitely agree. I think there's been a maturation overall. I'm happy to say we're seeing more and more startups ready to deal with the challenge of early childhood learning. It's distinct from regular training and upskilling and so on. So there's a care and concern that needs to be carefully constructed here that's different from the other segments. So I'm happy to see that maturation is also coming towards early childhood learning.
Sure. On another area, do you feel that, because now we've seen a great spurt, so while we've also seen in India that there has been rise in the number of EdTech companies, along with there are some companies on the top who've scaled up very well. So going forward, do you think the opportunity for each EdTech company is really to do a D2C model, or do you think they should actually be collaborating with core education and help in making digital and, maybe a screen and a board kind of a collaboration happening there? So, I mean, otherwise, we'll have too many EdTech companies over there in the market, and not everybody being able to find their customer once we are back out of, or once we're out of the pandemic. So what is your advice to the EdTech community at large? Who would like to take it up?
I'm happy to start, if that's okay. I think you're absolutely right. There is an arms race, right? Everyone's after the same 100 million K-12 EdTech users as one example. The same MAU, and that's going to result in a hyperinflation of CAC. You're already seeing that as money pours into the sector. And that's good, I think, to induce trial, which we've done over the last 2-3 years, but now the tough problems need to be solved. And amongst the tough problems are, of course, how do you deliver outcomes to your students, and so on, but also how do you solve problems in the larger ecosystem? So the offline tutors who need to make a living and are doing a pretty good job at a low cost of delivering quality learning outcomes in their neighborhoods. What can technology do to give them the scaffolding, the convenience, the content, and quality and engagement that they can use to scale their business? What can you do for schools? I mean, we are seeing a massive consolidation opportunity in K-12 offline schools, and schools will come back. They're all not going to be online Zoom calls, for long, hopefully. And companies like Lighthouse Learning are emerging as a consolidator in that space. But their strategy is not just to buy out schools. Their strategy is to digitize and use digitalization to drive efficiencies and quality and effectiveness of learning outcomes. So what can EdTech do to serve these platforms that are emerging? What can you do to enable schools to do a better job of student acquisition and driving learning effectiveness? So I think, working with the ecosystem, to my mind, is almost as big an opportunity as the direct-to-consumer opportunity, which seems to have attracted a lot of capital recently.
Sure.
Add Ritu, on a couple other points. I think obviously there's been disproportionate amount of capital and focus on the larger market, right? The hard skills, maths and test prep. I think there's a lot of opportunity on two areas. One, clearly, as you get down the pyramid where affordability is an issue. You need to find models where, which can't sustain that kind of CAC and, whether those are group models or assisted learning, cohorts, I don't know. But eventually, you need to figure out models where affordability problem can be solved, because that's a large segment in my mind. The other thing I think I touched upon is, I think there is a lot of scope, may not be as huge a market, on other skills beyond the hard skills. I think especially in India, I think there's just way too much focus on the same, the maths and the test prep and things of that nature. But I think, folks who are trying to build, life skills and, things of that nature, I think that's another opportunity, and I think that can make a huge impact versus just, improving marks and getting into, some great universities.
Sure. On the other hand, which are the companies, particularly, and in which sector do you think are more likely to sort of scale further? We've already seen Byju's and Vedantu and, who are actually probably just helping the core industry. But where do you see, 3 or 4 sectors? I know while we have touched upon them as we've spoken, but, particularly once the schools are open, once the universities are open, which are the 3 or 4 larger categories do you see emerging in EdTech? Amit, what has schools are open in US, so maybe you can.
No. So I'm happy to comment on that. So, I think one category that, or one place that a lot of folks kind of tend to immediately gravitate to when they think about education technology is like kind of curriculum solutions or assessment solutions. And, what I would describe almost as like front of classroom types of solutions, right? However, there's, I think, a whole host of solutions that we've seen that might not become obvious, right? Examples of that are kind of administrative software solutions, a lot of things that we've actually been used to, let's say, in the corporate world that does not exist within the education K-12 sector, for example, right? Example of this is, for example, trying to keep students safe online, right? And trying to make sure that students aren't experiencing cyberbullying or things like that, right? Making sure that they're kind of starting to understand how to become like online digital citizens, if you will, right? And so these are the types of solutions that maybe don't become as obvious when, kind of you first think about EdTech. The other thing is like, we actually have a category where we call EdTech Plus, where it's like EdTech plus another category, right? And so, one example of a company in India that we've made an investment in is a company called Leap Finance, which is actually helping students from India who want to go study abroad and kind of access kind of loans and just navigate the entire study abroad process, right? And, you know, kind of on one hand, you could think about it almost as a fintech company, and on the other hand, you can think about it as an edtech company. And so there's a whole host of companies that we've seen that are bringing edtech meets fintech. You know, FamPay is another example of a company that, you know, kind of recently raised money in India that's doing that. I'd say the US equivalent of kind of that would be a company like Greenlight, which we've made an investment in, which is helping, you know, kind of students in the K-12 sector kind of become financially literate, right? And not necessarily an obvious like kind of edtech solution in the sense of like a curriculum or assessment platform. And so, you know, I think there's a real blue ocean that exists when it comes to that type of solution to be created. And so, you know, excited to see about kind of what the next decade or two will hold for India when it comes to those types of solutions.
Sure. And finally, let me ask you this. Do you feel that there would be a good number of exits, you know, happening in the EdTech sector, even going forward, as we've seen a great volume of funding that has happened during this point of time during 2021? Do you, particularly from an Indian standpoint, do you see many new exits happening even in 21, 22? Pranav, Karan, if you would like to take that up.
I can go first. Certainly, I think the consolidation wave is not complete yet. While we've seen, of course, the market leaders, Byju, for example, is a category creator, I would say for sure. While they have consolidated fairly aggressively, I do know for a fact there will be more acquisitions. I think we're still to see large cap India corporate play a role in education and education technology. Of course, Reliance has imbibed. We expect the other groups will also start their foray into the space. So you've seen 1MG, Big Basket, a lot of the FMCG and grocery essential platforms be part of the first wave. We expect education and health will be part of the next wave. So certainly, I don't think EdTech consolidation in India is over anytime soon. There's still a lot more to come. I know Imran and Gaja are doing a lot more work on forward planning there as well. So it's a very exciting time, and I'm very happy to see that it's not just EdTech. It's as you know, a lot of IPOs across sectors in India, the startup ecosystem. So certainly, long view for us is that this is a very successful first cycle that's come to an end, and we expect much more excitement in the second cycle that starts now.
Sure. Karan?
Yeah. No, I'd obviously agree with that. I think, you know, a couple of things which we've seen. One is the ability of some of the larger platforms, Byju's, Unacademy being obvious ones, but even Vedantu, and we're seeing a few more coming up, which will, you know, who will build large, you know, disparate businesses by acquiring, because it's part of a much larger platform strategy, right? So I think that ability to be able to exit to some of the larger platforms who got currency is there. That's one. I think secondly, as Pranav said, there is a huge play for corporates to come in, but that will be in bits and pieces in areas which are of interest to them. Interestingly, you know, the strategic interest could also come from some completely unknown players. So one of our you know, portfolio companies, FirstCry, acquired a fairly large preschool chain almost 2 years back, because, you know, FirstCry is basically an e-commerce platform for babies and kids, but this was a way to get curriculum into build curriculum for schools, but then be able to serve the parents of these children in a much larger holistic manner. So there are some very surprising people and platforms that you would not necessarily think who will have a tangential interest in education and EdTech. It could be for the end user base, it could be for just a platform, it could be for distribution. So all three are ways to look at potential exits for startups. I think EdTech is certainly showing how that can be done, and certainly expect a lot more sponsor deals to also get done, you know, in the coming few years.
Sure. Ashish, you want to add something to that?
So let me just say this: if this was a 20-20 over game, we are in the third over, and the fifth ball is still to be bowled.
Sure. Okay, great. No, I think this was a fantastic conversation. It actually gave us a great sense of how the industry is going to pan out from here. Any final words that you would like to give? Maybe a quick one, starting with you, Imran.
No, I'm very excited about the potential of education and EdTech. I won't be surprised. We're currently at about $2.2 billion a year, a little over $2 billion per year of investments. I won't be surprised if we have a $10 billion year in the next decade. So very exciting times, but a lot of hard work because the basis of competition is moving to real problems as opposed to just top of the funnel.
Sure. Pranav?
I agree. I think like we discussed already, there's going to be a lot more action. There's going to be a lot more specialization. We're looking forward to founders who are now in the second or third company coming with even more hyper aggressive visions of the future that they're building out. I think there's been a cultural shift in India as well. The consumer is now much more educated, much more demanding, much more selective, and of course willing to spend. And I think that evolution leaves us with a very exciting new decade and a new type of consumer stream to latch onto. So very excited about what's to come.
Sure. Karan?
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add is, people, founders or people who will be founders have seen scale at other companies. They've seen how that's happened. And that's the same thing we saw with commerce. So this is an as large market. So I think that's one. The second is there will be two very distinct kinds of EdTech companies. One which are going deeper into India, the second are going much broader globally. There will be some overlap, obviously, but I think understanding the needs of global markets and the nuances, like as Amit was saying, but also understanding the intricacies of the Indian market, especially as you go beyond the first 100, 150 million users, will be really key in terms of how an investor can think about evaluating companies and then how those companies think about expanding. So I think both will be equally interesting. And it's a great time to be an EdTech entrepreneur or an investor focused on EdTech.
Sure. Ashish?
Yeah, and I think there is, I'm kind of excited about, what could some of the new technologies would bring to EdTech, and coming back to the affordability and kind of the, the missing 80% population, which may not be able to pay the kind of, so I think especially with AI, getting better, I feel like a hybrid assisted kind of a model with deep usage of AI. I think that has a lot of potential. So I'm sure you're going to see something interesting come out, which may not require, too many teachers and bodies being thrown for every course.
Sure. And Amit, finally to you.
Yeah, listen, I think we deeply believe that India is going to be kind of the epicenter or one of the world's epicenters when it comes to education, technology, innovation. I think from the entrepreneurial talent that kind of exists in India to the pace of innovation that's happening in India, and not only kind of being an epicenter, but really setting the pace at which companies are growing, how fast they can grow. And to add to maybe Imran's kind of prediction about what's going to happen in the next decade, it's our prediction that India is going to be home to several of the world's most valuable education technology companies, whether privately or publicly listed. That is certainly going to be the case.
Sure. Thanks once again. This has been a wonderful discussion, and hopefully the next time we'll have this discussion not on the confines of a screen, but in person, with hopefully the pandemic behind us. Thank you for joining us.